This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. The Cosmic Computer by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 9. Barathrum was a grim land, naked, black, and gray. Spines and crags of bare rock jutted up, lava flows like black glaciers twisting among them. It was split by faults and fissures, pimpled with ash cones. Except for the seabirds that nestled among the cliffs, and the few thin patches of green where seeds, wind-blown from the mainland, had taken root, it was as lifeless as when some ancient convulsion had thrust it up from the sea. Barathrum was a dead inferno, untenanted even by the damned. By comparison, the Badlands seemed lushly fertile. The four craft crossed above the line of white breakers that marked the division of sea and land. The gunboat Goblin in the lead, her sisters, Vampire and Dragon, to right and left and a little behind, and the Lester Dawes a few miles in the rear. Fred Karski was at the Goblin's controls. Conn, beside him, was peering ahead into the teleview screen and shifting his eyes from it to the map and back again. Somebody behind him was saying that it would be a nice place to be air-wrecked. Somebody else was telling him not to joke about it. From the radio, his father was asking, "Can you see it yet?" "Not yet. We're on the right map and compass direction. We should before long." "We're picking up radiation," Fred Karski said. "Way above normal count. I hope the place isn't hot." "We're getting that too," Rodney Maxwell said. "Looks like power radiation. Something must be on there." After 40 years, that didn't seem likely. He leaned over to look at the Omni-Geiger, then whistled. If that was normal leakage from inactive power units, there must be enough of them to power 10 towns the size of Litchfield. "Something's operating there," he said, and then realized what that meant. Somebody had beaten them to the spaceport. That would be one of the new companies formed after the opening of Force Command. He was wishing now that he hadn't let himself be talked out of coming here first. Older and wiser heads, indeed. Fred Karski whistled shrilly into his radiophone. "Attention everybody! General alert! Prepare for combat! Prepare to take immediate evasive action! We must assume that the spaceport is occupied, and that the occupants are hostile. Captain Poole, will you please make ready aboard your ship? Reduce both speed and altitude, and ready your guns and missiles at once." "Well, now, wait a minute, young fellow," Poole began to argue. "You don't know." "No, I don't. And I want all of us alive after we find out, too," Karski replied. Rodney Maxwell's voice, in the background, said something indistinguishable. Poole said ungraciously, "Well, all right, if you think so." The Lester Dawes began dropping to the rear and going down toward the ground. Conn returned to the teleview screen in time to see the truncated cone of the extinct volcano rise on the horizon, dwarfing everything around it. Fred Karski was talking to Colonel Zareff, back at Force Command, giving him the radiation count. "That's occupied," the old soldier replied. "Mass energy converter going. Now, Fred, don't start any shooting unless you have to. But don't get yourself blown to MC, waiting on them to fire the first shot." The dark cone bulked higher and higher in the screen. It must be 7 miles around the crater, and a mile deep. When that thing blew out, 10 or 15,000 years ago, it must have been something to see. Preferably from a ship 1,000 miles off planet. It was so huge that it was hard to realize that the humbled foothills around it were themselves respectably lofty mountains. When they were within 5 miles of it, something twinkled slightly near the summit. An instant later, the missile man, in his turret overhead, shouted, "Missile coming up! Counter-missile off!" "Grab on to something, everybody," Karski yelled, bracing himself in his seat. Conn, on his feet, flung his arms around an upright stanchion and hung on. Fred's hand gave a twisting jerk on the steering handle. The goblin went corkscrewing upward. In the rear-view screen, Conn saw a pink fireball blossom far below. The sound and the shockwave never reached them. The goblin outran them. Dragon and vampire were spiraling away in opposite directions. The radio was loud with voices, and a few of the words were almost printable. A gong began clanging from the command post on top of the mesa on the mainland. "Be quiet, all of you!" Clem Zareth was bellowing. "And get back from there! Back 3 or 4 miles! Close enough so they won't dare use thermonuclears. Take cover behind one of those ridges where they can't detect you. Then we can start figuring out what the Gehenna to do next." That made sense. And get it settled who's in command of this Donnybrook while we're at it, Conn thought. He looked into the rear and side view screens, and taking cover immediately made even more sense. 2 more fireballs blossomed, one dangerously close to the dragon. Guns were firing from the mountain top too, big ones, and the shells were bursting close to them. He saw a shell land on, and another beside, one of the enemy gun positions, 115 millimeters from the Lester Dawes, he supposed. He continued to cling to the stanchion, and the goblin shot straight up, and he was expecting to see the sky blacken and the stars come out when the gunboat leveled and started circling down again. The mountainside, he saw, was sending up a lightning-crackling tower of smoke and dust that swelled into a mushroom top. Clem Zareth on the radio was demanding to know who'd launched that. "We did it, sir. Dragon," Stephen Jorison was replying. "We had to get rid of it. We took a hit. Gun turret smashed. Mill Tennant's dead, and Abe Samuels probably will be before I'm done talking. And if we get this crate down in one piece, it'll do for a miracle till a real one happens." "Well, be careful how you shoot those things off," his father implored from the Lester Dawes. "Get one inside the crater, and we won't have any spaceport." The Lester Dawes vanished behind a mountain range a few miles from the volcano. The dragon, still airborne but in obvious difficulties, was limping after her, and the vampire was covering the withdrawal, firing rapidly but with doubtful effect with her single 90mm and tossing out countermissiles. There was another fireball between her and the mountain. Then, when the dragon had followed the Lester Dawes to safety, she turned tail and bolted, the goblin following. As they approached the mountains, something the shape of a recon car and about half the size passed them going in the opposite direction. As they dropped into chasm on the other side, another nuclear went off at the volcano. When Conn and Fred left the goblin and boarded the ship, they found Rodney Maxwell, Captain Poole, and a couple of others on the bridge. Charlie Gatworth, the skipper of the Vampire, Morgan Gatworth's son, was with them, and, imaged in a screen, so was Clem Zareth. One of the other screens, from a pickup on the Vampire, showed the dragon lying on her side, her turret crushed, and her gun, with the muzzle brake gone, bent upward. A couple of lorries from the Lester Dawes were alongside. As Conn watched, a blanket-wrapped body, and then another, were lowered from the disabled gunboat. "Fred, how are you and Charlie fixed for countermissiles?" Zareth was asking. "Get loaded up with them off the ship, as many as you can carry. Charlie, you go up on top of the ridge above, and take cover where you can watch the mountain. Transmit what you see back to the ship. Fred, you take a position about a quarter way around from where you are now. Don't let them send anything over, but don't start anything yourselves. I'm coming out with everything I can gather up here. I'll be along myself in a couple of hours, and the rest will be stringing in after me. In the meantime, Rodney, you're in command." Well, that settled that. There was one other point, though. "Colonel," Conn said, "I assume that this spaceport is occupied by one of those new prospecting companies. We have no right to take it away from them, have we?" "They fired on us without warning," Karski said. "They killed Milt, and it's 10-1 Abe won't live either. We owe them something for that." "We do, and we'll pay off. Conn, you assume wrong. This gang's been at the spaceport long enough to get the detection system working and put the defense batteries on ready. They didn't do that since this morning, and up to last evening they neglected to file claim. I'll assume they're on the wrong side of the law. They're outlaws, Conn. All the raids along the East Coast, everybody's blamed them on the Badlands gangs. I'll admit they're responsible for some of it, but I'll bet this gang at the spaceport is doing most of it." That was reasonable. Barathrum was closer to the scene of the worst outlaw depredations than the Badlands, not more than an hour at Mach 2. And nobody ever thought of Barathrum as an outlaw hangout. People rarely thought of Barathrum at all. He liked the idea. The only thing against it was that he wanted so badly to believe it. They brought the body of Milt Hennett aboard, and Abe Samuels, swatched in bandages and immobilized by narcotic injections. A few more of the Dragon's 6-man crew had been injured. Jorison, the skipper, had one trouser leg slit to the belt, and his right thigh splinted and bandaged. He took over the Lester Dawes missile controls, which he could manage sitting in one place. Fred Karski and Charlie Gatworth went aboard their craft and lifted out. For a long time, nothing happened. Conn got out the plans of the Volcano spaceport and the photo maps of the surrounding area. The principal entrance, the front door of the spaceport, was the crater of the extinct volcano itself. It was ringed, outside, with launching sites and gun positions, and according to the data he had, some of the guns were as big as 250 millimeter. How many outlaws there were to man them was a question a lot of people would get killed trying to answer. The ship docks and shops were down on the level of the crater floor, in caverns, both natural and excavated, that extended far back into the mountain. There were 2 galleries, one above the other, extending entirely around the inside of the crater near the top. Passages from them gave access to the outside gun and missile positions. With a dozen ships the size of the Lester Dawes, and about 5,000 men, and a CO who wasn't concerned with trivialities like casualties, they could have taken the place in half an hour. With what they had, trying to fight their way in at the top was out of the question. There was another way in. He had known about it from the beginning, and he was trying desperately to think of a way not to utilize it. It was a tunnel 2 miles long, running into some of the bottom workshops and storerooms back of the ship berths from a big blowhole or small crater at the foot of the mountain. According to the 50-year-old plans, it was big enough to take a gunboat in, and on paper it looked like a royal highway straight to the heart of the enemy's stronghold. To Conn, it looked like a wonderful place to commit suicide. He'd only had a short introductory course, in 1 semester, in military and protective robotics, just enough to give him a foundation if he wanted to go into that branch of the subject later. It was also enough to give him an idea of the sort of booby-traps that tunnel could be filled with. He knew what he'd have put into it if he'd been defending that place. Colonel Zaroff had sent one last message from Force Command when he lifted off with a flight of recon cars. After that, he maintained a communication blackout. It was an hour and a half before he got close enough to be detected from the outlaw stronghold. Immediately, the volcano began spewing out missiles. Poole hastily took the Lester Dawes 10 miles down the Rift Valley in 60 seconds, while Stephen Jorson put out a nuclear warhead missile and left it circling about where the ship had been. From their respective positions, Fred Karski and Charlie Gatworth filled the airspace midway to the volcano with countermissiles, each loaded with 4 rockets. There were explosions, fireballs in the air, and rising cumulus clouds of varicolored smoke and dust. Only about half the enemy missiles reached the Lester Dawes' former position. When the controllers, back at the volcano, couldn't see the ship in their screens, the missiles bunched together. Immediately, Jorison sent his missile up to join them and detonated it. Including his own, 8 nuclear weapons went off together in a single blast that shook the ground like an earthquake and churned the air like a hurricane. Clem Zareth came on screen at once. "Now what did you do?" he demanded. "Blew the whole place up, didn't you?" Rodney Maxwell told him. Zareth laughed. "They might just think they got the ship. All the pickups would be smashed before they could see what really happened. You're about 10 miles south of that? Be with you in a few minutes." They got a screen on for his rear-view pickup. Zareth had with him a dozen recon cars, some of them under robo-control. 6 gunboats followed, and behind them, to the horizon, other craft were strung out: airboats, troop carriers, and freight scows. They could see enemy missiles approaching in Zareth's front screen. Countermissiles got most of them, and a couple of pilotless recon cars were sacrificed. The Lester Dawes blasted more missiles as they crossed the top of the mountain range. Then Zareth's car was circling in and entering at one of the ship's open cargo ports. Zareth and Ance Dawes got out. "Gunboats are only half an hour behind," Zareth said. "Get some screens onto them, Ance. You know the combinations. Now let's see what kind of a mess we're in here." It was almost a miracle, the way the tottering old man Conn had seen on the dock at Litchfield when he had arrived from Terra had been rejuvenated. The rest of the reinforcements arrived slowly, sending missiles and countermissiles out ahead of them. Zareth began worrying about the supply. The enemy didn't seem to be running short. By 1300, Conn noted the time incredulously, the battle seemed to have been going on forever, instead of just 4 hours. The Lester Dawes had moved halfway around the volcano and was almost due west of it, and the 8 gunboats were spaced all around the perimeter. Then one stopped transmitting. In the screens there was a rising fireball where she had been. The radio was loud with verbal reports. "Poltergeist," Zareth said, naming half a dozen names. 1 or 2 of them had been schoolmates of Conn's at the academy. He knew how he'd feel about it later, but now it simply didn't register. "They're launching missiles faster than we can shoot them down," he said. "That's usually the beginning of the end," Zareth said. "I saw it happen too often during the war. We've got to get inside that place. It's a lot of harmless fun to send contragravity robots out to smash each other, but it doesn't win battles. Battles are won by men, standing with their feet on the ground, using personal weapons." "We'll have to win this one pretty soon," Rodney Maxwell said. "The amount of nuclear energy we've been releasing will be detectable anywhere on the planet by now. The government has a ship like the Lester Dawes in commission. If this keeps on, she'll be coming out for a look." "Then we'll have help," Captain Poole said. "We need government help like we needed the polka dot fever," Rodney Maxwell said. "If they get in it, they'll claim the spaceport themselves, and we'll have fought a battle for nothing." Well, that was it then. The spaceport was essential to the Maxwell plan. He'd gotten 7 men killed, 8 if the recon car that was taking Abe Samuels to the hospital in Litchfield didn't make it in time, and it was up to him to see that they hadn't died for nothing. He spread the photo map and the spaceport plans on the chart table. "Look at this," he said. Clem Zareth looked at it. He didn't like it any better than Conn had. He studied the plan for a moment, chewing his cigar. "You know, it's possible they don't know that thing exists." he said, without too much conviction. "You'll be betting the lives of at least 20 men. Fewer than that couldn't accomplish anything." "I'll be putting mine on the table along with them," Conn said. "I'll lead them in." He was wishing he hadn't had to say that. He did, though. It was the only thing he could say. "You better pick the men to go with me, Colonel," he continued. "You know them better than I do. We'll need working equipment, too. I have no idea what we may have to take out of the way inside." "I won't call for volunteers," Zareth said. "I'll pick home guards. They did their volunteering when they joined." "Let me pick one man, Colonel," Anstaw said. "I'll pick me." Chapter 10. They sent a snooper in first. It picked up faint radiation leakage from inactive power units of overhead lights, and nothing else. The tunnel stretched ahead of it, empty, and dark beyond its infrared vision. After it had gone a mile without triggering anything, the jeep followed. Anstaw's piloting, and Conn at the snooper controls watching what it transmitted back. The two lorries followed, loaded with men and equipment, and another jeep brought up the rear. They had cut screen and radio communication with the outside. They weren't even using inter-vehicle communication. At length, the snooper emerged into a big cavern, swinging slowly to scan it. The walls and ceiling were rough and irregular. It was natural instead of excavated. Only the floor had been leveled smooth. There were a lot of things in it, machinery and vehicles, all battered and in poor condition, dusty and cobwebbed, the spaceport junk heap. A passage, still large enough for one of the gunboats, led deeper into the mountain toward the crater. They sent the snooper in, and after a while followed. They came to other rectangular, excavated caverns. On the plans they were marked as storerooms. Cases and crates, indeterminate shrouded objects. Some had never been disturbed, but here and there they found evidence of recent investigation. Beyond was another passage, almost as wide as the mall in Litchfield. Even the Lester Dawes could have negotiated it. According to the plans, it ran straight out to the ship docks and the open crater beyond. Ants turned the jeep into a side passage, and Conn recalled the snooper and sent it ahead. On the plan, it led to another natural cavern. Half its width shown as level with the entrance. The other half was a pit, marked as 60 feet deep. Above this, and just under the ceiling, several passages branched out in different directions. The snooper reported visible light ahead, fluoroelectric light from one of the upper passages, and firelight from the pit. The air analyzer reported wood smoke and a faint odor of burning oil. He sent the snooper ahead, tilting it to look down into the pit. A small fire was burning in the center. Around it, in a circle, some 150 people, including a few women and children, sat, squatted, or reclined. A low hum of voices came out of the sound box. "Who the blazes are they?" Ants whispered. "I can't see any way they could have gotten down there." They were in rags, and they weren't armed. There wasn't so much as a knife or pistol among them. Conn motioned the lorries and the other jeep forward. "Prisoners," he said. "I think they were hauled down there on a scow, shoved off, and left when the fighting started." "Cover me," he told the men in the lorries. "I'm going down and talk to them." Somebody below must have heard something. As Ants took the jeep over and started floating it down, the circle around the fire began moving, the women and children being pushed to the rear and the men gathering up clubs and other chance weapons. By the time the jeep grounded, the men in the pit were standing defensively in front of the women and children. They were all dirty and ragged. The men were unshaven. There was a tall man with a grizzled beard, in greasy coveralls, another man with a black beard and an old Space Navy uniform, his head bandaged with a dirty and blood-caked rag. Another in the same uniform, wearing a cap on which the Terran Federation insignia had been replaced with the emblem of transcontinental and overseas ship lines and the words Chief Engineer. And beside the tall man with the gray beard was a girl in baggy trousers and a torn smock. Like the others, she was dirty, but in spite of the rags and filth, Conn saw that she was beautiful. Black hair, dark eyes, and impudently tilted nose. They all looked at him in hostility that gradually changed to perplexity and then hope. "Who are you?" the tall man with the gray beard asked. "You're none of this gang here." "Litchfield Exploration and Salvage. I'm Conn Maxwell." That meant nothing. None of them had been near a newspaper lately. "What's going on topside?" the man with the bandaged head and the 4 stripes on his sleeve asked. "There was firing, artillery and nuclears, and they herded us down here. Have you cleaned the bloody murderers out?" "We're working on it," Conn said. "I take it they aren't friends of yours." Foolish question of the year. They all made that evident. "They took my ship. They murdered my first officer and half my crew and passengers." "They burned our home and killed our servants," the girl said. "They kidnapped my father and me." "They've been keeping us here as slaves." "It's the Blackie Paralis gang," the tall man with the gray beard said. "They've been making us work for them, converting a blasted tub of a contragravity ship into a spacecraft." "I beg your pardon, Captain Nichols. She was a fine ship, for her intended purpose." "You're Captain Nichols?" Aunt Dawes exclaimed. "Of the Harriet Barn?" "That's right. The Harriet Barn's here. They've been making us work on her, to convert her to an interplanetary craft, of all idiotic things." "My name's Yves Jacquemont," the man with the gray beard said. "I'm a retired hyperspace maintenance engineer. I had a little business at Waterville, buying, selling, and rebuilding agricultural machinery. This gang found out about me. They raided and burned our village, and carried me and my daughter, Sylvie, away. We've been working for them for the last 4 months, tearing Captain Nichols' ship down and armoring her with collapsium." "How many pirates are there here?" That started an argument. Nobody was quite sure. 250 seemed to be the highest estimate, which Conn decided to play safe by accepting. "You get us out of here," Yves Jacquemont was saying. "All we want is a chance at them." "How about arms? You can't do much with clubs and fists." "Don't worry about that. We know where to get arms. The treasure house, where they store their loot. There's plenty of arms and ammunition, and anything else you can think of. They've used us to help stow the stuff. We know where it is." "Ants, you remember those scows we saw in the big room before we came to the broad passage? Take 4 men in the jeep, have them lift 2 of them and bring them here. Then you go to the end of the tunnel and call the Lester Dawes. Tell them what's happened. Tell them they can get gunboats all the way in, and wait to guide them when they arrive." When Ants turned and climbed into the jeep, he asked Yves Jacquemont, "Why does this Paralis want an interplanetary ship?" "He's crazy," Jacquemont swore. "Paranoid megalomaniac. He talks of organizing all the pirates and outlaws on the planet into one band and making himself king. He's heard that there are Space Navy superweapons on Koshai. I suppose there are, at that, and he wants to get a lot of planet busters and hellburners and annihilators." He lowered his voice. "Captain Nichols and I were going to fix up something that'd blow the Harriet Barn up as soon as he got her out of the atmosphere." He talked for a while to Jacquemont and his daughter Sylvie, and to Nichols and the chief engineer, whose name was Vibart. There was evidently nothing else at the spaceport of which a spaceship could be built, but there were foundries and rolling mills and a collapsed matter producer. The Harriet Barn was gutted, half torn down, and half armored with new collapsium-plated sheet steel. It might be possible to continue the work on her and take her into space. Then the two scows floated over the top of the pit and began letting down. They got the prisoners into them, the combat-effective men in one and the women and children in the other. At the top, he took over the remaining jeep, getting Jackmont, his daughter, and the two contragravity ship officers in with him. "Up to the top," Jackmont said. "Take the middle passage, and turn right at the next intersection." As they approached the section where the pirates stored their loot, the sound of guns and explosions grew louder, and they began picking up radio and screen signals, all of which were scrambled and incomprehensible. The pirates, in different positions, talking among themselves. With all that, it ought to be safe to use their own communication equipment. Nobody would notice it. The treasure room looked like a giant pack-rat's nest. Cases and crates of merchandise, bales, boxes, barrels, machinery, household and industrial robots. The prisoners piled out of the two scows and began rummaging. Somebody found a case of cigarettes and smashed it open. In a moment, cartons were being tossed around and opened, and everybody was smoking. The pirates evidently hadn't issued any tobacco rations to their prisoners. And they found arms and ammunition, began ripping open cases, handing out rifles, pistols, submachine guns. The prisoners grabbed them even more hungrily than the cigarettes. Sylvie Jackmont took charge of the ammunition. She had 3 men opening boxes for her, while she passed out boxes of cartridges and made sure that everybody had ammunition to fit their weapons. A ragged man, who might have been a farm tramp or rich planter before his capture, had gotten a bale of cloth open and was tossing rags around, while the chief engineer inspected weapons and showed people how to clean out the cosmoline and fill their spare magazines. Conn collected a few of his own party. "Let's look these robots over," he said. "Find about half a dozen we can load with blasting explosive and send ahead of us on contragravity." They found several: an electric light servicer, a couple of wall and window washers, a serving robot that looked as if it had come from a restaurant, and an all-purpose robo-janitor. In the passage outside, they began loading the lorries with bricks of ionite and packages of cataclysmite, packing all the scrap iron and other junk around the explosives that they could. As soon as they had weapons, the prisoners came swarming out, making more noise than was necessary, and a good deal more than was safe. Sylvie Jackmont, with a submachine gun slung from one shoulder and a canvas bag of spare magazines from the other, came over to see what he was doing. "Well, look what you're doing to him," she mock-reproached. "That's a dirty trick to play on a little robot." He grinned at her. "You and my mother would get along. She always treats robots like people." "Well, they are, sort of. They aren't alive. At least I don't think they are. But they do what you tell them, and they learn tricks, and they have personalities." That was true. He didn't think robots were alive either, though biophysics professors tended to become glibly evasive when pinned down to defining life. Robots could learn, if you use the term loosely enough, and any robot with more than 500 hours service picked up a definite and often exasperating personality. "I've been working with them, and tearing them down and fixing them ever since I was in pigtails," she added. The half-dozen natural leaders among the prisoners, Jackmont and his daughter, the 2 Harriet Barn officers, and a couple of others, bent over the photo-printed plans Conn had, located their position, and told him as much as they could about what lay ahead. Sylvie Jackmont could handle robots. She would ride in the front seat of the jeep while he piloted. Vibart, the chief engineer, and Eves Jackmont would ride behind. Nichols would ride in the scow with the fighting men. One lorry of his own party would follow the jeep. The other would bring up the rear. He snapped on the screen and punched the ship combination. Stefan Jorison appeared in it. "Hi, Conn. You all right?" He raised his voice. "Conn's on screen." His father appeared at Jorison's shoulder, and, a moment later, Clem Zareth. "Well, we're in all right," he said. "We just picked up an army, too." He swung the jeep to get the crowd in the pickup, explaining who they were. "Did you hear from Ance?" "Yes, he just screened in," Rodney Maxwell said. "He said a gunboat can get in." "That's right. Clear into the crater." "Well, we're going to put 3 of them inside," Zareth told him. "Werewolf, Zombie, and Diro. And a troop carrier with 50 men, flamethrowers, portable machine guns, bomb launchers. Regular special weapons section. What can you do where you are?" "Here? Nothing. We're going to work around to the other side of the crater, and then find a vertical shaft and go up topside and make as much disturbance as we can." "That's it," Zareth approved. "Pull them off balance. As soon as we get in, we'll go straight to the top. Look for us in about an hour. It's going to take time getting to the tunnel mouth without being spotted from above." He lifted the jeep and started off. The lorry and the scows and the other lorry followed. The Snooper and the bomb robots went ahead like a pack of hunting dogs. They went through great chambers, dark and silent and bulking with dusty machines. Jackmot explained that the prisoners had never gotten into this section. The Harriet barn was a mile or so to their right. Conn turned left, when the noise of firing from outside became plainer. A foundry, a machine shop which seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of a rush job that hadn't really been necessary. They came to a place even the Snooper couldn't enter, choked to the ceiling with dead vegetation, hydroponic seed plants that had been left untended to grow wild and die. They emerged into outside light in vast caves a mile high and open onto the crater, and looked across the floor that had been leveled and vitrified to the other side, 3.5 miles away. He didn't know whether to be more awed by the original eruption that had formed the crater or by the engineering feat of carving these docks and ship berths, big enough for the hugest hyperspaceship into it. At first, he had been afraid of getting into position too soon before the task force from outside could profit by the diversion. Then he began to worry about the time it was taking to get halfway around the crater. He could hear artillery thundering continuously above. Except at the very beginning of the battle, there had been little gunfire. He wondered if both sides were running out of lift-and-drive missiles, or if the fighting had gotten too close for anybody to risk using nuclear weapons. He was also worrying about the women and children among the released prisoners. "Why did the pirates bother with them?" he asked Sylvie. "They used the women and some of the old men to do housekeeping chores for them," she said. "Mostly, though, they were hostages. If the men didn't work, Paralis threatened to punish the women and children. I wasn't doing any housework. I'm too good a mechanic. I was helping on the ship." "Well, what'll I do with them when the fighting starts? I can't take them into battle." "You'll have to. It'll be the safest place for them. You can't leave them anywhere and risk having them recaptured. That means we'll have to detach some men to cover them, and that'll cut our striking force down." He whistled at the sound pickup of his screen and told his father about it. "What do I do with these people, anyhow?" "You're the officer in command, Conn," his father told him. "Your decision. How soon can you attack? We're almost through to the crater." "There's a vertical shaft right above us, and a lot of noise at the top. We'll send up a couple of bomb robots to clear things at the shaft head, and follow with everything we have." "Non-combatants and all?" He nodded. "Only thing we can do." An old quotation occurred to him. "If you want to make an omelet, you have to break eggs." He wondered who'd said that in the first place. One of the old pre-atomic conquerors. Maybe Hitler. No, Hitler would have said, "If you want to make sauerkraut, you have to chop cabbage." Maybe it was Caesar. "We'd better send Gumshoe Gus up first," Sylvie suggested. "You handle him. Take a quick look around, and then pull him back. We'll need him later." It was the first time he'd ever caught himself calling a robot him instead of it. He thought for a second and added, "Give your father and Mr. Vibart the controls for the 2 window washers. You handle the Snooper." He gave more instructions. Eves Jackmot to turn his bomb robot right, Vibart to turn his left, the 2 lorries to follow the jeep up the shaft, the scows to follow. Then he leaned back and looked at the screens that had been rigged under the top of the jeep. A circle of light appeared in one, growing larger and brighter as the Snooper approached the top of the shaft. 2 more came on as the bomb robots followed. "All right, follow me," he said into the inter-vehicle radio, and started the jeep slowly up the shaft. The Snooper popped out of the shaft onto a gallery that had been cut into the solid rock, 50 feet high and 150 across, with a low parapet on the outside and the mile-deep crater beyond. There were a few grounded air cars and lorries in sight, and a medium airboat rested 100 or so feet on the right of the shaft opening. 15 or 20 men were clustered around it, with a lifter loaded with ammunition. They looked like any crowd of farm tramps. Suddenly, one of them saw the Snooper, gave a yell, and fired at it with a rifle. Sylvie pulled it back into the shaft. Her father and the chief engineer sent the 2 bomb robots up onto the gallery. The right-hand robot sped at the airboat. The last thing Conn saw in its screen was a face, bearded and villainous and contorted with fright, looking out the pilot's window of the airboat. Then it went dead, and there was a roar from above. On the other side, several men were firing straight at the pickup of the other robot. It went dead too, and there was a second explosion. In the communication screen, somebody was yelling, "Give them another one for Milt Hennett!" And his father was urging him to get in fast, before they recovered. In peace or war, screen communication was a wonderful thing. The only trouble was that it let in too many kibitzers. The gallery, when the jeep emerged onto it, was empty except for casualties, a few still alive. The side of the airboat was caved in. The lifter load of ammunition had gone up with the bomb. He moved the jeep to the right of the shaft and waited for the vehicles behind him, suffering a brief indecision. Never divide your force in the presence of the enemy. There had been generals who had done that and gotten away with it, but they'd had names like Fox Travis and Robert E. Lee and Napoleon. Napoleon. That was one who'd made that crack about the omelets. They'd known what they were doing. He was playing this battle by ear. There was a lot of shouting ahead to the right. That meant live pirates, a deplorable situation which ought to be corrected at once. The communication screen was noisy now. His father had gotten to the top gallery with the 3 gun cutters, and was meeting resistance. He formed his column, his jeep and one of the lorries in front, the scows next, and the second lorry behind, and started around the gallery counterclockwise, the Snooper and the 3 remaining bomb robots ahead. They began running into resistance almost at once. Bullets spattered on the armored glass in front of him, spalling it and blotching it with metal, until he found that he could steer better by the showback of his view pickup. He used that until the pickup was shot out. Then his father began wanting to know, from the communication screen, what was going on and where he was. A bomb or something went off directly under the jeep, bouncing it almost to the ceiling. He found that it was impossible to lift it again after it settled to the floor of the gallery, and they all piled out to fight on foot. Sommers and his gang from the number 1 lorry were also afoot. Their vehicle had been disabled. He saw them lifting wounded into one of the scows. They blew up the light service robot to clear a nest of pirates who had taken cover ahead of them. They sent the robo-janitor up a side passage and exploded it in a missile launching position on the outside of the mountain. That produced a tremendous explosion. They began running out of cartridges and had to stop and glean more from enemy casualties. They expended their last bomb robot, the restaurant server, to break up another pirate resistance point. At length he found himself, with Sylvie and her father and one of the home guardsmen from Summers' lorry, lying behind an air car somebody had knocked out with a bazooka, with 2 dead pirates for company and a dozen distressingly live ones ahead behind an improvised barricade. Behind there was frantic firing. The near guard seemed to have run into trouble, probably from some gang that had come down from the upper level. He wondered what his father was doing with the gunboats, since abandoning the jeep he had lost his only means of contact. Suddenly, the men in front jumped up from their barricade and came running toward them. Been reinforced, now they were counterattacking. His rifle was empty. He drew his pistol and shot one of them, and then he saw that they were throwing up their hands and yelling for quarter. This was something new. He looked around quickly to make sure none of the liberated prisoners, except Jackmont and his daughter, were around, and then called to a couple of his own men to come up and help him. While they were relieving pirates of their pistol belts and cartridge bandoliers, more came up, their hands over their heads, herded by a combat car from which Tom Brangwyn covered them with a pair of 12mm machine guns. Tom hadn't put in an appearance before he had taken his commando force into the tunnel. He hadn't even known the chief of company police was on Barathrum. "Well, nice seeing you," he greeted. "How did you get in?" "Over the top," Brangwyn told him. "Everything's caved in on the other side. We have a quarter of the top gallery and half of this one. Your father's cleaning up above. Clem's got some men working along the outside." Sylvie was tugging at his arm. "Hey, look! Look at that!" she was clamoring. "Who's she belong to?" He looked. The Lester Dawes was coming over the edge of the crater. "She's ours," he said. "It's all over but the mopping up, and counting the egg breakage." End of Chapter 10.